Hi there, I'd like to welcome you to the Supplier Conflict of Interest template. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Alexandra Panich and I'm the head of product at Procurement Tactics. I will also be your guide through this template today. The team at Procurement Tactics has over 20 years of experience in procurement and negotiations, which we want to share with you. In this template, we will be focusing on what you should know about supplier conflict of interest and how to make your own supplier conflict policy and disclosure form. Let's get right into it. First and foremost, we have to understand the concept of supplier conflict of interest, especially in the context of procurement. A supplier conflict of interest occurs when the supplier's personal interests or obligations interfere with the procurement process, causing their decisions or actions to deviate from their duty to the company. This misalignment can compromise their objectivity, potentially leading to biased or unfair outcomes. A strong conflict of interest policy and vigilant monitoring is needed to guard the company's reputation and goals against problems of conflicts of interest. You may think it's easy to spot these problems of conflicts of interest, but they can be quite subtle and easy to miss or hide. Slightly favoring a company, for example, can be considered a conflict of interest and lead to worse problems like corruption or bribery. Here are some common ways that supplier conflict of interest may show itself. First off, we have the relationships. This can be a conflict of interest in many ways, but the main point is that there is an established relationship between an individual from the company and from the supplier that gives room for bias. This can mean familiar relationships or friendships, even if an individual from a company has previously worked for a supplier. Bias in the form of preferring certain suppliers over the others due to personal ties may occur. The next one is financial interest. If there is any financial interest for an individual with a supplier the organization is in contact with, then this is a clear conflict of interest. This can mean that an individual may be a shareholder in a supplier that their company is signing a contract with, or maybe someone has accepted a bribe in return for picking a certain supplier. The next one is gifts and benefits. Receiving or giving gifts or favors from a supplier causes a conflict of interest. This is because these actions can cause a sense of obligation to whichever party is involved. In turn, objectivity between the person or the persons involved is compromised and business decisions will no longer be in line with the company goals. Finally, we have the outside activities. Outside activities are a bit broader and sometimes feel like a mixture of relationships and financial interests, but it's less direct than both. This can mean an individual is consulting for another company or perhaps doing a part-time job or even maybe doing volunteer work for companies or suppliers that may color bias into their work decisions. These examples mentioned earlier paint a clearer picture of what makes supplier conflict of interest important to know. Corruption and other unethical business practices can quickly arise from conflicts of interest, which is why it should be avoided at all costs. So, how exactly do you avoid conflicts of interest? First and foremost, you need to develop a clear conflict of interest policy that clearly outlines what constitutes of conflicts of interest. The policy should include who within the organization is liable for the policy and what procedures to follow in the management and mitigation of conflict of interest. You should also require an annual conflict of interest disclosure from your suppliers to identify potential issues upfront. This allows suppliers to be upfront and honest about concerns of conflicts of interest, which can be looked into right away. The next one is manage and mitigate. In this step, you make sure you manage and mitigate conflicts of interest, all with a standard procedure, of course. Make sure that your monitoring system is efficient in tracking supplier performance and other concerns like payments and incentives. The more thorough, the better. Also, monitor any feedback for signs of favoritism. Don't forget to set up a confidential channel for reporting any suspicion of conflicts of interest. When conflicts of interest are identified, then immediate action should be taken to minimize risks. Investigations and implementation of corrective measures can be taken. When finding out conflict of interest, consequences should be given. Various actions can be taken depending on the severity. Here are some of those actions. Recusal. This is when you exclude a supplier from a specific transaction wherein a conflict of interest may exist. Renegotiations. Sometimes you can work your way around a conflict, which is why renegotiations exist, as you can recreate the contract between your organization and the supplier to address the problem. This can mean that you have all different teams or different stakeholders in charge or involved in the contract recreations to ensure that there is no longer a conflict of interest. Third one is termination. If a conflict of interest is too significant to avoid, then a termination of a contract may be unavoidable, but if a contract is not yet in the works, then simply not doing business with a supplier that has a conflict of interest is the best option. Finally, we have the record and review. For reviewing these cases, For reviewing these cases down the line, make sure to evaluate your process and find ways to make it better. A conflict of interest policy can always be updated, and by reviewing your process, you can do exactly that. Reviews can happen right after with your team if necessary, or later on down the line for a rescheduled review of all of your cases. This is also why it's important to maintain a record for all disclosures, evaluations, and action taken. It's important to provide a clear audit trail, and it's also useful in facilitating future investigations if necessary. Finally, we have the communicate and enforce. Making a policy and requiring conflict of interest disclosure is only the beginning of the work. You have to make sure to communicate your conflict of interest policy and enforce procedures to all stakeholders, including suppliers and possible suppliers. There should also be a training of employees when it comes to the conflict of interest policy and disclosure form, best done during onboarding, but should also be redone annually. This would be beneficial as the policy may continually be updated and employees should be up to date with the internal policies. Education of basic policies such as this is not to be taken lightly, as employees should know what is expected of them with regards to behavior and ethical standards. This ensures transparency in your procurement process and discourages non-compliance. Rewarding employees for upholding policies is also a good incentive for them to follow your policies and report any infractions. And of course, you, as a leader, should be a guide thinker for upholding your company's policies. Leading with integrity always inspires loyal and trustworthy coworkers, so never stray and they will know sure how to follow you. Following all these steps will maximize your advantage against supplier conflict of interest and minimize the risk your organization may have otherwise. Now, onto the supplier conflict of interest policy and disclosure. There are two very important things to have for these 4 steps, and those are the supplier conflict of interest policy and the conflict of interest disclosure. These two are built as a backbone for the prevention of supplier conflict of interest. First, the policy. Here are the essentials of what you should have in your procurement policy. These key elements can serve as a backbone of your policy. This makes it easier to progress in the creation of your supplier conflict of interest policy and ensures that you have all of the essentials for the effective and efficient policy. To make it easier for you, we've created an outline and a sample policy as well, so you can download it and personalize it to benefit your own needs. First off, we have the definition. Give a clear definition of what a conflict of interest is and go into detail if possible. Financial interests, relationships, etc. The next one is prohibited conflict of interest. To further specify, add examples of specific conflicts of interest that are relevant for your organization. This could be things like outside employment restrictions and so on. Next, we have the disclosure process. Make sure that you establish a system for your employees and suppliers to disclose potential conflicts of interest. This starts with a conflict of interest disclosure form, which will be further discussed later on. This also emphasizes transparency and early reporting. Next, we have the resolution process. Make sure to include an outline of steps that you can take to review, disclose the conflict of interest cases, and to determine what actions to take for each case, whether this is for recusal, renegotiation, or termination. Then we have the conflict of interest disclosure form. A basic conflict of interest disclosure form usually comes with a conflict of interest policy, as these two are the fundamental requirements to prevent problems of conflicts of interest from turning into real and actively harmful risks. This disclosure form gives individuals the chance to be honest and transparent when it comes to possible conflicts of interest that might cloud their judgment during procurement decisions. Here are some essentials needed. When it comes to possible conflicts of interest that might cloud their judgments during procurement decisions. Here are some essentials needed for a basic conflict of interest disclosure form. First and foremost, the core of the form should ask the individual to disclose details in the key categories. Here we have the financial interest, relationships, gifts and benefits, and outside activities. Specify the details of each category in your conflicts of interest disclosure form and make sure that you have space for additional context like companies or individuals involved. It may also be beneficial to include some space for suggestions when it comes to management and mitigation of the conflict of interest to foster collaboration and risk management. Specifics may vary depending on your organizations, but there are some essentials a basic supplier conflict of interest disclosure should have. Now, we made one that you may personalize for your own needs along with our sample conflicts of interest policy, which doubles as an outline. And that's a wrap for the supplier conflict of interest template. If you want to keep your knowledge on procurement in top shape, then don't hesitate to check out our procurement courses and procurement templates. We hope to see you in our next template or lesson.